Hi, my name is Videau, and I'm going to be presenting Where We Stand. So I first want to talk about oppression and diversity. There are three different elements of oppression. The first element of oppression talks about norm versus other. So the norm in the society that we live in would be a white heterosexual male, and then others would be anybody who doesn't necessarily fit into that category. The next element of oppression is ideology and the threat of violence. So ideology tends to justify why people are oppressed. So in terms of race, you would use an example of white people are superior based on race. Oppression is also held into place by threats of violence. There is physical and direct violence, so an example of that would be lynching, but then there's also personal and psychological violence. An example of that is poverty. Another element of oppression is institutionalized oppression. So oppression and discrimination that is built into our laws, policies, programs, things like that. Diversity, as we all know, it are differences among people. So age, race, gender, political affiliation, sexual orientation, your ethnicity, your gender, all those different things. And intersectionality talks about all of those different factors coming together to make you into one person. But intersectionality also talks about the ways in which people discriminate on those different factors. So discriminate against you based on you being a black, gay woman who may have a low socioeconomic status. All of those things intersect. So at the forefront of social and economic justice, you have human rights. There are three different aspects associated with human rights. The first are political and human freedoms. So political and human freedoms tend to be the right to life or guarantees against discrimination and torture. The second, standard of living, deals with adequate housing, food, and access to medical care. The third, rights among nations, deals with international solidarity among nations. So, in terms of political and human freedoms, there's a whole bunch of different videos that portray all of these different terms that are relevant. So, for example, in Being Black in America, the young man talks about different stereotypes associated with black men, such as black men dealing drugs, black men stealing, all these different kind of things to make a living. In terms of intellectual disabilities, there are stereotypes associated with people that have an intellectual disability not being able to fit into society. They can't get a job. They can't live on their own. In terms of power and privilege, you can see that played out into the video about LGBTQ students, to where they don't have power within their institutions to make accommodations for themselves. They talk about feeling very uncomfortable and alienated in those institutions, to where they feel like they might get harassed on their way to class. So LGBT students are very discriminated against in school. Black people also experience alienation in the way that they separate themselves to be less discriminated against. In the film talking about 7 kids in one apartment, he talks about not liking being born into poverty. He talks about he wished he was born into more money. He wished he didn't have to work so hard just to make a living. And so that ties into power, privilege, and acclaim, because those who have power are born into these situations where they have money. They have the privileges that they need to work and become successful. They also have acclaim, so they're famous. They're more able to get things that they need. So in terms of standard of living, we have the 7 Kids in One Apartment film, which talks about poverty, and they're not necessarily they're living in relative poverty. They're living in relative poverty because the family with the Hispanic boy, it's 7 kids to 1 bedroom, and they're able to meet the basic necessities of life. However, they're poor in consideration to the other people around them. In terms of economic inequality, black people, Hispanics, LGBTQ, they all experience this because these different groups, they aren't allowed the same access to jobs. They aren't allowed the same access to living. A lot of these people are separated. They live in ghettos. They live in separate institutions. And they also don't have the same privileges as others.